I join the Senator from Missouri, the Senator from Alaska, and many other senators calling for the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act. This bill is part of a last of a breed, a bill that we pass every single year from the Congress with a large bipartisan majority for 58 straight years. It's not derailed by petty partisan politics or grievances between the parties. It gets large bipartisan majorities because Congress has understood for those 58 years that the national defense must come before politics. It's the definition of a must-pass act. But time is short to get it right, unfortunately, because of those very kind of petty partisan politics. This bill is an opportunity to continue rebuilding our military after 8 years of stagnation and cuts by the last administration. The bill would increase funding to our troops by $22 billion, money that we could spend on cutting-edge technologies like new vertical lift jet engines to give our troops an edge in future conflicts. This kind of investment is essential, especially as storm clouds brew in the Western Pacific from a rising China. The Chinese Communist Party is not derailed by petty partisan politics, and therefore it is investing huge sums to transform its military into a world-class force capable of rivaling and, they hope, ultimately defeating our own military. At the same time, China is pursuing an aggressive technology strategy to dominate the next generation of military hardware. Beijing's ultimate goal, of course, is to replace us not just as the most powerful country in the Western Pacific, but in the entire world. So we must invest in our military right now, or else we will reap that whirlwind in the future. There's many other important measures that have been included in this year's defense bill that won't pass, that won't even see the light of day on the Senate floor if we fail to pass that bill. There's the Fentanyl Sanctions Act, my bipartisan legislation that would crack down on foreign criminals, mostly Chinese, who smuggle deadly poisons across our border. Synthetic opioids kill tens of thousands of Americans every year. And that toll will continue to rise if we don't start to bust up the criminal networks that originate in China and then come through Mexico to poison our communities. So let's pass the defense bill to give law enforcement the tools of the Fentanyl Sanctions Act. There's also the PCS Act, my legislation that would help military spouses transfer their occupational licenses across state lines. When your husband or your wife is in the military, you follow their career. And if you're a lawyer or a nurse or a teacher or any of the other hundreds of jobs that require an occupational license in this country, you face barriers to working and putting food on the table for your family. This bill would allow military spouses to continue to pursue their careers uninterrupted and therefore allow their military service members to focus on their own mission, not worried about their spouse's jobs. There's also legislation to honor the 241 American victims of the Beirut Marine barracks bombing perpetrated by an Iranian suicide bomber 36 years ago last month. The defense bill would designate the anniversary of that bombing as a national day of remembrance and strengthen our resolve to fight the terrorist forces that carried it out and that threaten our security to this day. There's also the opportunity to strengthen trade restrictions on Huawei by including in the defense bill the Protecting America's 5G Future Act. Huawei is the eyes and ears of the Chinese Communist Party overseas, so we must deny it access to our sensitive networks and the networks of our allies. 91 senators voted to instruct the conference committee to include that legislation in the defense bill. There's still hope it can be included, but only if we pass the defense bill in the first place. If we don't, then China's spy company stands to gain. Now, this is far from an exhaustive list of the reforms that are or could be included in this year's defense bill. It's just a sample of the many valuable and bipartisan measures under consideration. But it also underscores the importance of passing the defense bill in the first place. Consider the alternative to passing the National Defense Authorization Act, a terrible stopgap spending measure that would include zero reforms, and that would degrade the fighting capability of our military, even as we face rising threats from China and Russia every day. A stopgap spending measure would freeze defense spending at last year's levels. But that's not to say that business would go on as usual. Oh, no, 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 no. Inflation would continue to erode purchasing power of last year's funding levels, and the military would have to tear up and renegotiate many of its multi-year contracts with defense companies. Renegotiating those contracts would cost billions in administrative expenses that could have otherwise gone for pay and benefits for our fighting men and women, or new aircraft, or new ships, or new guns, or new munitions. This so-called spending freeze would in fact cost taxpayers an arm and a leg. All the more reason why Congress must act once again to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, as we have for 58 years, without being divided by petty partisan politics. So I urge my colleagues to put aside their partisan objections on issues that are really not even related to our military, make the hard compromises necessary, pass this bill, and give our troops what they need. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.